1864, Missouri. Widow Thornton and the horrific serial murder conspiracy. In the winter of 1864, the small town of Willow Creek, Missouri, recorded 12 military weddings and 11 military funerals within a 10-month period. What made these statistics particularly alarming was not just the rapid succession of deaths, but the fact that all of the deceased soldiers had been married to the same woman. Her name was Abigail Thornton, and by the end of the war, local records showed she had buried 11 husbands, collected their military pensions, and somehow maintained a reputation as the most devoted war widow, affectionately known as the Angel of Willow Creek. The official cause of death for each soldier was always the same: complications from war wounds, compounded by what the town doctor called a field fever. But the contents of a recently discovered journal would suggest something far more sinister. The diary, found in 1928 during the clearing of an old warehouse, revealed that a local pastor had begun to investigate the unusual mortality rate of soldiers under Abigail's care. His investigation was cut short when the pastor himself, Jeremiah Cole, vanished without a trace under what were later described as highly suspicious circumstances. What the authorities would find in Abigail's attic years later would change everything we thought we knew about Civil War medicine and raise questions about how many other devoted widows might have been carrying out similar schemes across the war-torn countryside. Before we continue the story of Abigail Thornton and her systematic approach to matrimony, I want you to know that this channel is dedicated to bringing you the most chilling and mysterious stories from American history. If you're fascinated by the dark secrets hidden in our past, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. And I'd love to know where you're listening from. Leave a comment below letting me know what state or city you're in and whether your area has any similar mystery stories from the Civil War era. Now, to truly understand how Abigail Thornton was able to operate her deadly scheme for so long, we need to look at the unique circumstances that made Willow Creek the perfect hunting ground for a woman of her particular talents. Willow Creek, Missouri, in 1863, was a town caught between two worlds. Situated along a key waterway on the Mississippi River, it occupied a precarious position, frequently seeing the passage of both Union and Confederate soldiers. The town's strategic importance lay not in its size, only about 600 residents called it home, but in its location, which made it a crucial transit point for wounded soldiers. The war had transformed Willow Creek from a quiet river community into a makeshift medical hub. Old riverside warehouses had been converted into field hospitals, while private homes opened their doors to injured soldiers in need of long-term care. It was into this chaos that Abigail Thornton arrived in the fall of 1863, carrying nothing more than a small suitcase and a letter of introduction from a street Louis minister who praised her boundless compassion and natural gift for the healing arts. By all accounts, Abigail was a striking woman of 30, with shimmering blonde hair and deep, soulful blue eyes, possessing what the local newspaper would later describe as a beauty, both ethereal and filled with the compassion of a devout believer. Her circumstances, as she told them, were a tragic romance. Her husband, a Union captain, had been killed at Gettysburg, leaving her alone in the world with her grief and a singular desire to devote the rest of her life to caring for other mothers' sons. The people of Willow Creek welcomed her immediately. Mrs. Martha Grayson, who ran the boarding house where Abigail took a room, would later recall that the young woman seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to soothe the pain of wounded soldiers. She had a magic touch, Mrs. Grayson told a newspaper reporter years later. The boys would be gritting their teeth when Dr. Morrow tended to their wounds, but they'd become as peaceful as children when Miss Abigail was administering her care. What the townspeople didn't know was that Abigail had arrived in Willow Creek with more than just compassion. Hidden in a false bottom in her suitcase was a small, leather-bound notebook, its pages filled with meticulous notes written in a small, precise script. The notebook appeared to contain herbal remedies and treatments, but upon closer inspection, it would have revealed something far more sinister. Detailed observations on the effects of various herbs and chemicals on human physiology, complete with notes on dosage, timing, and symptoms. Abigail's timing could not have been more perfect. A series of recent skirmishes had left Willow Creek's field hospital overflowing, and the overworked Dr. Morrow was grateful for her help. Within weeks, she had established herself as the most competent nurse in the area, and her reputation for bringing comfort to dying soldiers had spread throughout the military camps. But it was her personal story that truly endeared her to the community. In her second month in Willow Creek, Abigail confided to Mrs. Grayson that her husband, a Union captain, had fallen at Gettysburg. This tragedy, she claimed, had left a deep wound in her heart, but filled it with a fierce desire to care for other mothers' sons who were dying far from home. It was the perfect cover for a woman with far darker intentions. On a cold November evening in 1863, Private Samuel Holt of the Missouri Infantry became Abigail Thornton's first husband in Willow Creek. The wedding took place in the warehouse-turned-chapel, with Dr. Morrow himself as a witness and Mrs. Grayson tearfully declaring it the most romantic wartime ceremony she had ever seen. Samuel was the son of a blacksmith from western Missouri who had taken a piece of shrapnel to the calf during a skirmish near Vicksburg. The wound had become infected during the long journey to Willow Creek, leaving him unable to walk without assistance and facing the possibility of amputation. When Abigail volunteered to take him into her private care, the arrangement seemed both practical and divinely inspired. The courtship, if it could be called that, lasted exactly 2 weeks. Samuel, grateful for her constant care and moved by her apparent devotion to his recovery, proposed on a chilly Saturday evening as she was changing his bandages by lamplight. Abigail accepted with tears of joy, according to witnesses, though she insisted they be married immediately before he could be transferred away. "I cannot bear the thought of losing another love to this terrible war," she told Mrs. Grayson. "If God grants us but a short time together, let us at least have the blessing of marriage." The ceremony took place on the 20th of November, 1863, with Samuel propped up on makeshift crutches and Abigail looking ethereal in a simple gray dress she had sewn herself. Dr. Morrow noted in his journal that the groom seemed unusually pale and complained of indigestion, but he attributed it to pre-wedding jitters and the excitement of the occasion. The honeymoon lasted exactly 5 days. On the morning of November 25th, Mrs. Grayson found Abigail sobbing over Samuel's lifeless body. The young soldier had died sometime during the night, apparently from what Dr. Morrow would later diagnose as an acute field fever brought on by the infection from his battlefield wound. His final hours had been marked by intense stomach cramps, violent vomiting, and episodes of delirium, during which he repeatedly whispered warnings about medicine bitter as hell and the angel's eyes. Dr. Morrow, overwhelmed with other patients and moved by Abigail's apparent grief, conducted only a cursory examination. The symptoms were consistent with sepsis from the leg wound, and Samuel had been receiving various herbal treatments that could have caused digestive upset. More importantly, Abigail's grief seemed entirely genuine. She had to be physically restrained from throwing herself onto the coffin during the burial service. What Dr. Morrow failed to notice were the faint bruises on Samuel's arms, marks consistent with repeated injections from some kind of crude syringe. Nor did he examine the small vial of clear liquid that Abigail discreetly removed from under the mattress while he was preparing the death certificate. The town mourned with its newest widow, and a collection was taken up to help her through her time of grief. When word came 2 weeks later that Samuel's military pension would be paid to his surviving wife, the general consensus was that God had provided for the poor woman in her time of need. Abigail used part of the pension to purchase a small house by the river, explaining that she needed privacy to properly mourn her husband. She also invested in what she called medical supplies, various herbs, tinctures, and glass jars that she claimed would help her better serve the wounded soldiers who continued to arrive in Willow Creek. The house by the river soon became known throughout the military camps as a place where the most hopeless cases could find comfort and care. Soldiers too badly wounded to remain in the field hospital were often brought to Abigail's door, where she would provide them with private rooms, nourishing meals, and around-the-clock care. It was also where she would conduct her next 10 marriages, each ending with the same tragic, yet explainable, outcome. By the spring of 1864, a disturbing pattern was beginning to emerge in Willow Creek. Though few of the townspeople were willing to admit what they were seeing, Abigail Thornton had married and buried 3 more soldiers. Sergeant John Miller of the Illinois Cavalry, Private Edward Price of the Tennessee Artillery, and Corporal Thomas Reed, a young Union soldier recovering from a bout of malaria. Each marriage followed the same trajectory: a wounded soldier under Abigail's care, a swift courtship marked by the man's apparent devotion to his nurse, a hastily arranged wedding, and death within a week of the ceremony. Each death was attributed to complications from war wounds, and each death left Abigail a little richer, a little more respected in the community, and a little more eager to help the next batch of wounded soldiers arriving at Willow Creek's field hospital. Dr. Morrow was beginning to have his own private concerns about the pattern, but his worries were easily explained away. The soldiers Abigail married were always the most severely wounded or emotionally broken men under his care, those for whom he had already privately given up hope. Her willingness to care for them in their final days seemed an act of charity of the highest order. If they died despite her efforts, it was the tragic reality of war. The townspeople had embraced Abigail as a local hero. The newspaper ran a feature on the Angel of Willow Creek, praising her selfless devotion to comforting dying soldiers in their final moments. The church ladies competed to bring her baked goods and offer emotional support during her periods of mourning. Veterans who had recovered under her care credited her with saving their lives, though none of them had been sick enough to require marriage as part of their treatment. Military authorities were slower to recognize the pattern, largely because the soldiers who died under Abigail's care came from different regiments and sometimes from both sides of the conflict. The death of a Union sergeant in March was not automatically connected to the death of a Confederate private in May, especially when both deaths were attributed to medical causes and certified by a civilian doctor. But by the summer of 1864, certain details had begun to attract attention from an unlikely source. Reverend Jeremiah Cole, a military veteran who had studied medicine before entering the priesthood at the local church. Cole, a middle-aged man with a sharp eye for detail, had served in the early days of the war before a wound forced him out of service. He was driven by a deep sense of justice and an analytical mind honed by both medical and spiritual training. It was those qualities that led him to see what others had overlooked. The Reverend's concerns began when he was called to administer last rites to Corporal Reed. During a rare moment of lucidity, the young soldier made disturbing comments about his wife's herbal tea and expressed a fear that he was being hurried along to the next world. Jeremiah had initially dismissed this as the delirium of a dying man, but when similar comments were whispered by Private Nathaniel Brooks, Abigail's eighth husband, a few months later, he began to pay closer attention. Jeremiah began keeping his own informal records of the deaths in Willow Creek, noting not just the official cause but also the circumstances surrounding each case. What he discovered troubled him deeply. The soldiers who died under Abigail's care were not always the most severely wounded men in the hospital. They were often among those with the best prospects for recovery. Furthermore, their symptoms in their final days always included intense abdominal pain, vomiting, and episodes of delirium not typically associated with their original injuries. The Reverend's suspicions came to a head on an August afternoon in 1864 when he was called to the bedside of Private Nathaniel Brooks, Abigail's eighth husband. Brooks had been wounded in the arm during an ambush, a painful but hardly life-threatening injury. Under Abigail's care, however, he had declined rapidly, developing the same set of symptoms that had marked the final days of her previous husbands. As Jeremiah read the last prayers, Brooks gripped his wrist with surprising strength and whispered words that would haunt the Reverend for the rest of his life. "She's killing us, Reverend. The medicine, it's bitter as gall. She's killing us for the money, and she'll keep on killing until someone stops her." Brooks died less than an hour later, his death certificate citing complications from a battlefield wound. But Jeremiah had heard enough. He began to conduct his own quiet investigation into the deaths surrounding Abigail Thornton, unaware that his activities had not gone unnoticed by the woman herself. Reverend Jeremiah Cole's investigation into the deaths surrounding Abigail Thornton required extraordinary discretion. He was, after all, investigating a woman regarded as the town's angel, and his accusations would need to be supported by irrefutable evidence. More dangerously, if his suspicions were correct, he was dealing with a woman who had already killed 8 men and showed no signs of stopping. The Reverend began by examining death reports from other river towns, looking for similar patterns. What he discovered was both alarming and illuminating. In 2 other Missouri towns and 1 in Arkansas, there were reports of unusually high mortality rates for soldiers being cared for in private homes by war widows. In each case, The women had married multiple soldiers and inherited their pensions. In each case, the official cause of death was listed as complications from war wounds. Jeremiah's correspondence with ministers in these other towns revealed more disturbing details. The women all shared common traits. They were beautiful, claimed medical knowledge, and had appeared in their communities in the early months of the war, bearing letters of introduction from distant clergymen. Most significantly, several of the women had been seen purchasing unusual quantities of certain herbs and chemicals from local apothecaries. Armed with this information, Jeremiah began to discreetly interview apothecaries in the surrounding towns. What he learned sent a chill down his spine. An apothecary in a neighboring town reported selling a large quantity of belladonna to a woman matching Abigail's description, who claimed she needed it to make eye drops for her patients. Another had sold her a significant amount of strychnine, a powerful poison she said was for dealing with rodents in her medical storage shed. Most disturbing was his conversation with a Native American man named Samuel Two Feathers, a local herbalist who lived deep in the woods. He had been approached by Abigail several months earlier for information on roots that could ease a soldier's pain permanently. Samuel had been suspicious of the request and refused to provide the information, but he remembered Abigail asking specifically about plants that could induce symptoms of convulsions and severe abdominal distress. While Jeremiah was gathering his evidence, Abigail was preparing for her 11th marriage. Her latest target was Sergeant Michael Donovan, a Union artillery officer who had suffered burns to his arms from a gunpowder explosion. Donovan's wounds were healing well under Dr. Morrow's care, but Abigail had convinced the doctor that the young officer's mental state required her special attention. "He suffers from the trembles and the frights," she explained to Dr. Morrow. "The poor boy jumps at every loud noise and cannot sleep soundly. I believe he would benefit from the kind of personal care that only a home nurse can provide." Donovan was indeed suffering from what we would today call PTSD, and he was grateful for Abigail's attention. She seemed to understand his pain in ways others could not, listening patiently as he described the horrors he had witnessed and offering a comfort that went beyond the purely medical. The courtship progressed along the same pattern that had marked her previous relationships. Within 2 weeks, Donovan was professing his love and talking of marriage as soon as he was well enough to return to duty. Abigail accepted his proposal with tears of joy, once again insisting that they marry immediately rather than risk being separated by the fortunes of war. The wedding was set for the 25th of December, 1864, Christmas Day, but Reverend Jeremiah had no intention of letting Abigail claim another victim. On December 22, 3 days before the scheduled wedding, Jeremiah requested a private meeting with Colonel William Carver, the commanding officer responsible for Union forces in the area. What transpired in that meeting would determine whether Abigail's killing spree would continue or whether justice would finally catch up to the woman the press had dubbed the Angel of Willow Creek. The meeting took place in Colonel Carver's makeshift office in a requisitioned warehouse, with Dr. Morrow also present at the colonel's request. Jeremiah laid out his evidence methodically: the pattern of deaths, the suspicious symptoms, the purchases of toxic substances, and the testimony of dying soldiers who claimed they were being poisoned. Colonel Carver listened with growing alarm, but Dr. Morrow was skeptical. "Reverend, I understand your concern, but you're making serious allegations against a woman who has shown nothing but compassion. These men were all severely wounded or emotionally broken. Their deaths, while tragic, were not unexpected." "Then explain this," Jeremiah replied, producing a small, stained piece of cloth he had recovered from the room where Private Brooks had died. "I found this hidden under his pillow after he passed. I took the liberty of sending it to a trusted chemist in Street, Louis, for analysis. On the cloth were traces of belladonna and a small amount of strychnine, a combination that would produce the exact symptoms Jeremiah had observed in the dying soldiers. In small doses, the mixture would cause digestive upset and mild delirium that could be mistaken for fever. In larger doses, it would produce the violent convulsions and hallucinations that had marked the soldiers' final hours." Dr. Morrow took the cloth with a trembling hand. "Where exactly did you find this?" "Hidden inside the straw pillow, wrapped in a small cloth. I noticed the stitching was unusually fine, as if it had been fashioned into a pouch for transporting something undetected." Colonel Carver made his decision quickly. We need to search her house before the wedding. If we find more evidence, we'll arrest her under military authority. But this has to be handled discreetly. If word gets out too soon, she could flee or destroy the evidence. The search was planned for the morning of December 24th, while Abigail was at the church, making final arrangements for her wedding. But what they would find in her house by the river would go far beyond even their darkest suspicions about the woman who had deceived an entire community. The search of Abigail Thornton's house began at dawn on the 24th of December 1864. Colonel Carver had assembled a small team consisting of himself, Reverend Jeremiah, Dr. Morrow, and a seasoned provost sergeant. They waited until they saw Abigail leave for her morning visit to the church, then quickly entered the house using a key Mrs. Grayson had reluctantly provided. What they found in the main rooms was what one would expect in the home of a devoted war widow: Bibles, framed pictures of her deceased husbands, medical supplies neatly arranged on shelves, and letters from grateful soldiers thanking her for her care. But the real discoveries awaited them in the attic, which Abigail used for her private storage. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard, they found her most incriminating possessions. First was the leather-bound notebook Jeremiah had suspected existed, a detailed record of her treatments written in Abigail's precise hand. But as they read through its pages, they realized this was more than just a record of murders. It was a scientific treatise documenting the effects of various poisons on human physiology with the cold objectivity of a trained researcher. Each entry began with the subject's name, physical condition, and military background. This was followed by detailed notes on dosage, timing, and observed effects. Subject N. Brooks responded well to initial dose of belladonna in tea. Mild delirium commenced within 4 hours. Will increase dosage tomorrow evening to accelerate progress. Another entry read, strychnine proves more effective for final stage. Subject expired within 24 hours with convulsive symptoms consistent with field fever. No suspicion from Dr. M. Dr. Morrow read these entries with growing horror, recognizing his own medical observations, quoted alongside Abigail's more sinister notes. She had been using his legitimate diagnoses to cover her tracks, timing her poisonings to coincide with the expected complications from the soldiers' wounds. But the notebook contained more than just the records of her murders. The earliest entries, dating back to 1861, described experiments on stray animals in the back alleys of Street Louis, carefully documenting which substances were most effective and which produced symptoms that might attract unwanted attention. Later entries referred to practice subjects elderly and destitute men who had died under her care before she came to Willow Creek. The provost sergeant found more evidence in Abigail's kitchen, a collection of glass vials containing various substances, each labeled with innocuous names like calming herbal tea and stomach tonic, but which actually contained lethal concentrations of belladonna, strychnine, and mercury compounds. Hidden in a sugar canister, they discovered several syringes of varying sizes, each showing signs of recent use. Perhaps most chilling was what they found in her bedroom wardrobe, a collection of military insignia and final letters taken from her dead husbands, along with forged papers that would have allowed her to collect military pensions from multiple units. She had been planning to expand her operations, moving to different towns and assuming new identities as circumstances required. But it was Reverend Jeremiah who made the most disturbing discovery in a small tin box hidden under Abigail's bed. He found correspondence with other women who were running similar schemes in different states. The letters revealed that Abigail was part of a larger network of war widows who shared information on effective poisons, believable cover stories, and methods for avoiding detection. One letter, dated October 1864, was from a woman who called herself Clara in Tennessee. The belladonna works perfectly when mixed with strong spirits. The soldiers actually ask for their sleeping draught, believing it will grant them a peaceful night's rest. I have perfected the timing. They pass 4 days after the wedding, allowing enough time for the marriage to be legally recorded, but not long enough for any suspicion to develop. Another letter from someone named Eleanor in Georgia contained even more practical advice. Always choose soldiers with no nearby family who might ask questions. The psychologically traumatized men are the best targets. No one comes looking for answers. The pension claims are easier to process when there are no competing claims from parents or siblings. As the search party absorbed these revelations, they realized they were dealing with something far larger than a single female killer. They had uncovered evidence of an organized conspiracy that may have claimed dozens of lives across the war-torn western states. Colonel Carver decided to expand the investigation immediately. Messages were dispatched to military authorities in Tennessee, Georgia, and other states, alerting them to the network and providing descriptions of the suspects. In the meantime, plans were made to arrest Abigail as soon as she returned from the church. But as the team prepared to leave the house, they discovered their investigation had not gone unnoticed. Through the front window, they could see Abigail standing at the end of the river path, seemingly in conversation with Mrs. Grayson. Even at that distance, it was clear she was looking directly at her house and had noticed the signs of a search. As they watched, Abigail suddenly turned and began walking briskly toward the church. But instead of entering the building, she continued past it, heading for the dense woods behind the town. She was carrying a small bag, and her pace suggested flight rather than a casual stroll. "She knows," Colonel Carver said grimly. "Sergeant, take 2 men and circle around through the woods. Reverend, you and Dr. Morrow, come with me. We'll approach from the main path. She will not escape justice, and we cannot risk her alerting the others in her network." The hunt for Abigail Thornton was about to begin, but first, they had to find her before she could disappear into the Missouri wilderness, or worse, before she could claim one final victim in the form of Sergeant Donovan, who was still waiting at the church for his bride to arrive for their final wedding preparations. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Willow Creek intensifies. If this story is sending chills down your spine, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss stories like this one. Together, let's discover what happens next in this twisted tale of murder disguised as compassion. The hunt for Abigail Thornton led the search party through the dense woods behind the Willow Creek Church, where a cold December wind whipped through the trees, making the pursuit both difficult and more urgent. Colonel Carver split his men into 2 groups, one to search the area around the town, and the other to pursue Abigail into the wilderness, where she appeared to be heading. What they didn't know was that Abigail was not fleeing at all. Instead, she had circled back through the woods to the church, where Sergeant Donovan was waiting for their final wedding preparations. If she was going to be exposed, she intended to claim one last victim and one final pension before facing the consequences of her actions. It was Reverend Jeremiah who first realized her true destination. "The church," he said breathlessly to Colonel Carver as they regrouped after finding no trace of her in the woods. "She's gone back for Donovan. She knows we're onto her, but she won't give up her final prize without a fight." They ran through the muddy streets of Willow Creek, their boots echoing on the frozen ground as they raced to prevent what they now realized was Abigail's final planned murder. But as they burst through the doors of the small church, they found a scene that would haunt their nightmares for years to come. Sergeant Donovan was on his knees in the front pew, his head thrown back at an unnatural angle, his eyes wide with terror but already glazing over. Froth was forming at the corners of his mouth, and his hands were clawing desperately at his own throat. Standing over him, still in her simple wedding dress, was Abigail, holding a small, empty syringe from which the poison she had just administered was still dripping. "You're too late, gentlemen," she said calmly, her voice carrying the same gentle tones she had used to comfort dying soldiers. "Michael has just received his final dose. He will be at peace within minutes." Dr. Morrow rushed to Donovan's side, checking his pulse and examining his pupils. "What did you give him?" "Pure strychnine," Abigail replied matter-of-factly. "It's much faster than my usual mixtures, though it does produce more violent convulsions. I save it for special occasions." Colonel Carver drew his pistol, though he kept it pointed at the floor. "Abigail Thornton, by the authority of the United States Army, you are under arrest for the murder of Union soldiers and conspiracy to defraud the federal government." Abigail laughed, a sound that was somehow more terrifying than any scream. "Murder. I prefer to think of it as deliverance. These boys were all dying anyway, Colonel. If not from their wounds, then from the demons in their heads. I simply gave them a helping hand while ensuring their sacrifice would provide for someone who actually needed the money. Is that so different from what you doctors do every day? You killed healthy men. Reverend Jeremiah said, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and horror. Donovan's wounds were healing perfectly. He would have lived a full life. Would he have? Abigail challenged. Would any of them? Have you seen what this war does to a man's mind, Reverend? I've seen hundreds of soldiers recover from their physical wounds, only to spend the rest of their lives haunted by their memories, unable to lead normal lives, turning to the bottle to forget what they've seen. I gave them peace, and I gave their widows financial security. Everyone benefited. As she spoke, Donovan's convulsions intensified, and Dr. Morrow worked frantically to counteract the effects of the poison. But even as he tried to induce vomiting and apply what few antidotes he had on hand, it was clear that Abigail had calculated her final dose perfectly. There's something else you should know, Abigail continued, her voice becoming almost conversational. The network you've uncovered, it's much larger than you imagine. There are dozens of us operating from Missouri to Georgia. We communicate through a system of coded letters sent to church addresses and general stores. Some of my colleagues have been at this since the war began, and they have perfected techniques that make my methods look crude by comparison. She reached into a dress and produced a folded letter. This arrived yesterday from my contact in Atlanta. She's identified 5 potential targets among the wounded at the Army hospital there. By next month, she'll be a 5-time widow and several $100s richer. Colonel Carver snatched the letter from her hand, scanning its contents with growing alarm. The document contained not only detailed plans for more murders, but also a list of contacts in other cities, code phrases for identifying co-conspirators, and instructions for forging military pension documents. "Why are you telling us this?" he demanded. Abigail smiled, and for the first time, her expression revealed the true cruelty that had been hidden beneath her saintly facade. "Because you'll never catch them all. The system we've created is too sophisticated, too discreet. Even if you arrest me, even if you execute me, the network will continue. There are too many desperate women and too many dying soldiers for this to end with my capture." Her words would prove to be prophetic as Sergeant Donovan drew his last, agonizing breath. Abigail Thornton looked around the church that had hosted 10 of her 11 weddings and added, "Besides, gentlemen, who is going to believe that the angels of mercy, the devoted war widows who sacrifice everything to comfort our brave soldiers, are actually cold-blooded killers? The public will never accept it. You'll be the ones who are seen as villains for persecuting grieving women." She was right about the public's reaction, though wrong about the extent of the justice that would eventually follow. But as Colonel Carver placed her in handcuffs and prepared to transport her to Street Louis for trial, none of them could have predicted the full scale of the conspiracy they had uncovered, or the number of additional victims whose deaths would eventually be linked to the network of women who had turned battlefield medicine into a cover for systematic murder. The trial of Abigail Thornton began in Street Louis on the 10th of March, 1865, just over 2 months after her arrest in Willow Creek. Despite her prediction that the public would refuse to believe the charges against her, the evidence recovered from her house proved to be overwhelming. The notebook detailing her experiments, the correspondence with her fellow conspirators, and the testimony of Reverend Jeremiah and Dr. Morrow painted a picture of calculated evil that shocked even war-hardened observers. Military prosecutors presented evidence linking Abigail to the deaths of 11 soldiers in Willow Creek, plus additional murders she had committed in Street Louis before her arrival in the smaller town. The network of war widows she had described was real. Investigations launched on her information led to arrests in 5 other states, ultimately exposing a conspiracy that had claimed the lives of more than 24 men across the West. What made the case particularly disturbing was the revelation of how systematically the murders had been planned. The women in the network had developed profiles of ideal victims: soldiers with no surviving relatives, psychologically traumatized men who were unlikely to be questioned closely by medical authorities, and wounded warriors whose deaths could easily be attributed to complications from their injuries. The trial also revealed the sophisticated methods the conspirators had used to avoid detection. They rotated among different towns, used multiple identities, and carefully timed their activities to coincide with major battles when military record-keeping was at its most chaotic. They had cultivated relationships with corrupt clerks who would process pension claims without rigorous verification, and they had developed a coded correspondence system that allowed them to share information on effective poisons and successful techniques. Dr. Morrow's testimony proved to be particularly damaging. Under oath, he admitted that he had never conducted a thorough post-mortem on the soldiers who died in Abigail's care, relying instead on her own reports of their symptoms to determine the cause of death. His trust in her medical knowledge and saintly demeanor had made him an unwitting accomplice in multiple murders. But perhaps the most chilling testimony came from Samuel Two Feathers, the herbalist who had refused to help Abigail. Under questioning, he revealed that Abigail had asked specifically about roots that would mimic the symptoms of field fever. He had been disturbed by the request and had warned others in his tribe to be wary of any woman asking similar questions. The defense tried to argue that Abigail had been driven to her actions by the trauma of losing her own husband at Gettysburg, suggesting that grief and a misguided desire to help suffering soldiers had led her to commit mercy killings rather than murders for profit. However, the prosecution's presentation of her detailed financial records and evidence of premeditation made this argument untenable. On the 15th of April, 1865, Abigail Thornton was found guilty on 11 counts of murder and conspiracy to defraud the United States government. The military tribunal sentenced her to death by hanging, making her one of the few women to be executed for war crimes during the Civil War era. Her final statement, delivered from the gallows on the 1st of May, 1865, offered no remorse or explanation that would satisfy those who had followed her case. "I regret only that my research was interrupted," she said simply, "but I do not regret bringing deliverance to men who would have suffered far more if left to live with their wounds and their memories. History will judge whether my compassion was more cruel than your justice." The broader investigation into the War Widows conspiracy continued throughout 1865. Military authorities eventually identified some 20 women operating in the network, though only 5 were ever successfully arrested and tried. The others disappeared into the chaos of wartime America, presumably to continue their operations under new identities. The most disturbing aspect of the investigation was the discovery that the conspiracy had been operating for much longer than originally thought. Evidence found in Abigail's correspondence suggested that similar networks had been active during the Mexican-American War and possibly even earlier conflicts, indicating that the systematic murder of wounded soldiers for financial gain had been a hidden feature of American military history for decades. The impact on Willow Creek was profound and long-lasting. Dr. Morrow, overwhelmed by guilt for his role in facilitating the murders, resigned his practice and became a recluse, unable to continue practicing medicine knowing how cruelly his trust had been exploited. Mrs. Grayson sold the boarding house and moved to live with relatives in Illinois, claiming she could no longer sleep in the building where Abigail had planned her crimes. The small church, where Sergeant Donovan was murdered, was abandoned by its congregation, who felt the building had been too defiled to ever serve as a house of worship again. For years afterward, local residents reported hearing strange whispers coming from the abandoned river house at night, though the sounds were more likely the result of wind whistling through broken windows than the presence of any supernatural forces. Sergeant Donovan was buried in Willow Creek's military cemetery with full honors, though his headstone made no mention of the circumstances of his death. Military authorities decided that revealing the details of how he died would serve no purpose other than to cause additional pain to his family and undermine public confidence in battlefield medical care. The pension money Abigail had collected from her murdered husbands was never fully recovered. Military investigators estimated she had stolen nearly $4,000 from the federal government, a staggering sum equivalent to several years' wages for most Americans. Some of this money was found hidden in her house, but the majority appeared to have been sent to other members of the conspiracy or invested in supplies for future operations. Perhaps most unsettling was the realization that Abigail's network may have represented only a fraction of similar operations. The chaos of the Civil War, with its massive casualty rates and overwhelmed medical facilities, had created the perfect conditions for this kind of predatory behavior. Military authorities issued new guidelines for the treatment of wounded soldiers, requiring multiple physicians to sign off on death certificates and mandating more thorough investigations of any soldier who died in private medical care. But these guidelines came too late for the men who had already died, and too late to prevent the psychological trauma inflicted on the communities that had unwittingly harbored their killers. The case of Abigail Thornton became a cautionary tale about the dangers of placing blind faith in apparent compassion and about the need for vigilance even in times of crisis when people are at their most vulnerable. The records of the investigation were sealed by military authorities and kept secret for nearly 60 years. When they were finally opened to historians in the 1920 seconds, the documents revealed additional details that had been considered too disturbing for public release during the war years. Among these was evidence suggesting that some members of the conspiracy had targeted not only wounded soldiers, but also elderly civilians and orphaned children, using the same methods to claim inheritances and life insurance payments. Modern forensic analysis of the preserved evidence has confirmed that Abigail's methods were indeed scientifically sophisticated for their time. The poison mixtures she used were carefully calculated to produce symptoms indistinguishable from common battlefield diseases, and her timing was precise enough to avoid creating obvious patterns that would have invited investigation. The case also highlighted the weaknesses of the military record-keeping system during wartime. The pension fraud aspect of the conspiracy was only possible because overworked clerks were processing claims with minimal verification, relying on local officials who may have been bribed or deceived themselves. The reforms implemented in response to the Thornton investigation became the foundation for modern military benefits administration, though they came at the cost of dozens of lives. Today, the river house where Abigail committed her final murders still stands in Willow Creek, though it has changed hands many times over the years. Local real estate agents report that it remains a difficult property to sell, not because of any supernatural phenomena, but because the historical association with the murders continues to disturb potential buyers. The house is now abandoned, its windows boarded up, and its walls covered in ivy, a silent reminder of its dark past. The church where Sergeant Donovan died was finally torn down in 1901, but the cemetery where Abigail's victims are buried is still active. Their graves, marked only by their names and dates, offer no clue as to the circumstances that brought these men to their final resting place. Visitors to the cemetery sometimes note that the graves of Abigail's victims seem to be arranged in a rough circle, as if standing guard over an empty space in the center, which had originally been reserved for her own burial, though her body was eventually interred in an unmarked grave outside St. Louis following her execution. The broader historical impact of the Abigail Thornton case goes beyond its immediate victims. The investigation exposed systemic weaknesses in Civil War-era institutions that allowed predators to exploit both military bureaucracy and public sympathy for personal gain. The case contributed to post-war reforms in medical certification, military record-keeping, and pension administration that helped prevent similar conspiracies in future conflicts. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the case is the reminder it provides of the capacity for evil to hide behind the most convincing masks of charity and compassion. Abigail Thornton was able to operate for as long as she did, not because she was particularly brilliant or her methods were undetectable, but because the people around her were unwilling to believe that someone who seemed so devoted to helping others could in fact be systematically killing them. The final chapter in the Abigail Thornton story came in 1928, when the clearing of an old warehouse in St. Louis uncovered additional documents related to her case. Among these papers was a final, unsent letter she had written, apparently intended for her contacts in the conspiracy network. In it, she expressed no remorse for her actions, but rather frustration that her research had been interrupted before she could perfect her techniques. "The work we have done," she wrote, "represents an advance in the science of deliverance, even if society is not yet ready to appreciate our contributions. Future generations will understand that we were pioneers in the humane management of suffering, and that our methods were more merciful than the prolonged agony that war so often inflicts upon its victims." This final document, with its complete absence of moral awareness and its recasting of systematic murder as a scientific advancement provided the clearest insight into the mindset that drove one of the most disturbing criminal conspiracies in American military history. This mystery shows us that even in times of crisis, when communities come together to support their most vulnerable members, evil can find a way to exploit our better instincts for its own ends. The story of Abigail Thornton reminds us that vigilance and critical thinking are necessary even when, and especially when, we want to believe in the goodness of those who offer to help the afflicted. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything has been revealed about Abigail Thornton's network? Or could there be other co-conspirators who escaped justice? How many other war widows might have been operating similar schemes during America's bloodiest conflict? Leave your comments below and share your thoughts on this chilling chapter of Civil War history. If you enjoyed this story and want more historical horror, be sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves a good mystery. See you in the next video, where we'll uncover another dark secret hidden in America's past.